One should not forget, in addition to the fact that Russia's population was much larger than other major capitalist countries in terms of its population, which made it even more inferior to these countries in terms of the number of heavy industry products that averaged per capita. If, for example, Russia occupied the fifth place in the world in terms of the volume of pig iron production, then it occupied the eighth place in the world at the rate per capita. So it was with the production of steel. The output of steel per capita was 11 times less in Imperial Russia than in the United States, 8 times less than in Germany, 6 times less than in England, and 4 times less than in France. The extraction of coal and brown coal, in terms of coal per capita, was 26 times less than in the US, 31 times less than in England, 15 times less than in Germany, and 5 times less than in France. Pointing to the low level of metal consumption in Russia as a sign of its backwardness, Lenin wrote, half a century after the liberation of peasants, the consumption of iron in Russia has increased fivefold, yet Russia remains incredibly and unprecedentedly backward country, penniless and half-savage, equipped with modern tools of production 4 times worse than England, 5 times worse than Germany, 10 times worse than America. Lenin, SOCH, Volume XVI, p. 543. The backwardness of Russia's heavy industry was expressed, however, not only in the relatively small size of its output, but also in its technical weakness and its low labor productivity. While in the coal industry of England, the average annual productivity of one worker was more than 15,000 poods before the war, and about 41,000 poods in the United States, and in Russia it was approaching only 9,000 poods. The total percentage of mechanized coal production in Russia in 1913 was 1.7, in England, 7.7, in the United States, more than 50. According to rough estimates, in Russia on the eve of the war, on average, one worker, counting industry and agriculture, 5 Lach forces of mechanical energy, whereas in Germany already in 1910, one worker accounted for 3.9 Lachs forces, in France in 1911, 2.8, in England in 1908, 3.6. The annual productivity of a factory worker in Russia was 1,810 rubles in 1908, and in the USA it was already 2,860 rubles in 1860, having reached 6,264 rubles in 1910. The backwardness of the pre-war Russian economy was also evidenced by the extremely weak development of domestic engineering. The output of machine building in Russia in 1913 was only 6.8% of all production of large-scale industry. As a result, the Russian machine building industry on the eve of the war ensured Russia's need for industrial equipment at a cost of only 38.6%. All the rest of the equipment was imported from abroad. For individual industries, the dependence on imports of foreign equipment was significantly higher than this average, reaching, for example, 80% of the demand for the textile industry. In an insignificant amount, rolling equipment, hydro turbines were manufactured in Russia, coal cutters, jackhammers, cars and many other machines were not manufactured at all. The economic backwardness of Tsarist Russia was also reflected in the fact that the share of large-scale industry in the aggregate output of large-scale industry and agriculture was less than the share of agriculture, accounting for 42.1% of the gross output of these industries, while the output of agriculture was 57.9%. In the largest industry, the production of means of production was less than the production of consumer goods, accounting for only 42.9% of the gross output of large-scale industry. For a full range of industries, including logging and rafting, workshops with railroads, depot and fishing industry. While the products of the metalworking industry accounted for about 11% of the total industrial output in Russia in 1908, the output of the textile industry was 28%, and the output of the food industry, over 34%. These figures, testifying to the backwardness of Russian industry, also indicate the presence of the most serious disproportions in the latter. The backwardness was also manifested in the fact that the urban population in 1912 was less than 14%, and the population of villages, more than 86% of the total population of Russia, whereas in England at that time in cities lived 78% of the total population, in Germany, 66%, in the United States, 42%, and in France, 41%. Thus, the national economy of Tsarist Russia was clearly of an agrarian nature. The agriculture of Tsarist Russia was also characterized by extreme backwardness, in which the remnants of serfdom were most affected. In his work, The Agrarian Question in Russia at the end of the 19th century, pointing to the growth in the production and importation of agricultural machinery to Russia and stressing that this fact indicates the progress of capitalist agriculture, Lenin also noted the extreme slowness of this progress, pointing further that in the United States in 1900 agricultural machinery was manufactured for $157.7 million. Lenin adds, "The Russian figures are ridiculously small compared to these, and they are small because we have strong feudal latifundia." Lenin, Works, Volume XII, p. 231. On average, in a number of areas, improved agricultural implements were used by 42% of landowners and only 21% of peasants. Did this situation change significantly towards the beginning of the imperialist war? In absolute figures, imports and own production of agricultural machinery have, of course, grown during this time. In total, counting their own production and imports, Russian agriculture received in 1912 machines and implements for 112 million rubles, against approximately 28 million rubles in 1900. The growth is quite large. However, compared to the advanced capitalist countries, especially the United States, the cost of cars in Russia's agriculture and on the eve of the war was ridiculously small. The condition of agricultural machinery on the eve of the imperialist war is also characterized by the following figures. In 1910, in agriculture in Russia, about 8 million sowers, rodeer and sablons were used as tools for plowing, that is, for the most primitive tools and iron plows only a little more than 4 million. In peasant farms per 1 ha of sowing an average of 6 rubles. Agricultural machines and implements, tractors and cars. Agriculture of Tsarist Russia absolutely did not know. Improved guns were used mainly in landlord farms, and from kolkhoz farms with the rarest exceptions they were used only kulak. The economy of the bulk of the peasantry was at an exceptionally low technical level. The amount of mineral fertilizers used in the agriculture of Tsarist Russia was very small. In a large part of the agricultural south the peasants did not use manure fertilizer, and in landlord farms only very few applied it. The dominant system of crop cultivation in Tsarist Russia was the three-field. All this could not but lead to the fact that Russia was one of the last places in the world in terms of productivity. On the eve of the war, Russia took the 16th place in the world in terms of wheat yield, and the rye yield, 10th. In the peasant economy, which was the basis of Russian agriculture, the yield was much lower than that of the landlords. Inside the peasant economy, the yield of fields of the middle peasants, and especially the poor, was in turn lower than the yield in the kulak farm. The yield of grain in the middle peasantry, and even more so in the poor economy, was more unstable than in landlord and kulak farms. In none of the capitalist countries was famine such a frequent visitor as in Tsarist Russia. Almost every year, some part of Russia was hit by a famine, which very often took the form of a colossal people's disaster. And in those years when the crop failure did not take the nature of the disaster, the poor were undernourished, although they had to throw some of their bread onto the market. On the eve of the war, in almost half, 48.7% of the counties, the collection of food loaves was less than 15 poods per capita of the rural population on average. and more than a quarter, 28.6% of counties, less than 10 PUDs. Agricultural fishing in Russia, 1914. These figures include kulak and landlord bread, which is at least half of the gross output of bread. Hence we can conclude that for a huge mass of middle peasants and poor people the collection of bread was less than the above average, making up a hungry rate. Even less was the share of the middle peasant and poor peasants in the commodity output of bread, amounting to only 28.4%, whereas kulak farms accounted for 50%, and landlords, 21.6% of all commodity output of bread by non-village turnover. Meanwhile, the poor alone accounted for 65% of all peasant households, and 85% with the middle peasants. The poor peasant was in addition to the burden of huge taxes, rent payments, etc. The landlords made money on the need of the people. The kulaks, who at the expense of their starving neighbors, also extracted enormous profits. Cattle breeding in Tsarist Russia was not in a better position than agriculture. For every 100 acres of land in 1910, there were cattle heads. Statistical Yearbook for 1914, page 822.